Welcome everyone to our third session of the Modern Change Launch and Learn series. Today we're covering dynamic risk. We have Daniel back again, and we have some more folks who he'll introduce in a little bit. Going to do some demos. So let's jump in. Real quick before we go, we have the safe harbor again. So like we've said, there may be some forward-looking statements in this presentation. They're based on our best understanding at this point in time, so please don't take anything as set in stone, as it could change.
So, some familiar slides for those who've been on webinars. And what we're looking at is how change can transform and why change needs to transform. So why now? People have been talking about change management for a long time. I've been working in the field for about 15 years, and we've had lots of talk about how change management works and making change management better. But what we're seeing is a drive from organizations to make change management happen faster, to be able to handle a higher volume of change, more emphasis than ever on the stability of the organization through change management, and the ability to control governance and to control compliance and things like security patching through making changes faster, through making changes more efficiently. There's new ways of working coming along, things like DevOps out there, which mean that changes are normally smaller, need to happen more rapidly, and that means more changes. So again, velocity and volume. And if we don't do these changes at the velocity that these teams require us to do them at, then changes get stacked up, and actually we can end up affecting stability negatively because we can't move fast enough. So the paradigm that we used to have, which was valid at the time, that changes kind of need to be slow moving so that we can do a lot of assurance around these things, they're quite big objects that we're putting in, has changed. We need to be able to automate a lot to do with change, a lot of types of change, but we also need to be able to work with our more legacy or estate, so that we can continue to do the change we need to do, normal standard emergency changes within ITIL. But we need a way of working with these new federated change processes, these different ways of doing things, site reliability management, DevOps just being a couple of examples of that, but also things like cloud infra. Just examples of that. So a model-based approach is what we're looking at for change management. We've covered that in the previous webinars, but it's a way of pushing the envelope with velocity, volume, stability, compliance, pushing into all directions of that envelope in one way. And we covered models and we covered approval policies in the previous webinars. And we did a webinar right at the start where we talked about the overall concepts we're going to cover throughout this series. But the topic of today is around risk management, which is a big part of change. One view of the change adoption journey. So we were talking before about how we replace our legacy workflows with flows, reduce our technical debt, start defining change models, and we do state transitions, and we use those things. We've talked about them in the previous sessions. We've talked about governance as well. So make sure the governance is right for the context that we're using it. Make sure that when we have shift left processes, we have governance that's fairly automated and keeps guardrails in place. Or where we don't have that, where we're making traditional bigger changes, that we have the governance kind of embedded in the change and we do a more traditional process. But we need to make sure policies are adhered to throughout the change process. We want to be more data driven, and we'll talk about that today. So when we're doing our approval policies we talked about, when we're doing creating our change models, when we're doing risk evaluations, we have both the opportunity and the benefit of being more data driven. We have more data than ever as well. As teams adopt things, like we have integrations to DevOps systems that have a kind of wealth of stories, planning items, security scans, vulnerability scans, all those kind of things are in there. Code sniffs, those things are all in there. So we can start pulling that data in. As our CMDB matures, we can start using not just the individual CIs in the CMDB, which is great. We can also start using relationships to look at things like impact. So as we drive as we get more data in the systems, we can look at that data. We can drive automation as well, and we can take the subjectivity out of the change process where it's appropriate. So really, it's about driving traceability and velocity in the change process, and this is part of the kind of maturity curve. So and move towards a place where appropriate, again, we have full change automation, where we only interact with changes where there's a need to interact with them. And that might be every change that a certain team are doing, or it could be, like the example of DevOps, it could be that we're interacting with the minority of those changes which happen at a certain time. Maybe there's a P1 in production right now and we need to have a look at that change. Or maybe we get the feeling that they're not adhering to the guardrails because things are failing, or maybe there's something specific in nature about that change they're making that we're picking up from the structured data that means that we need to think about intervening with that change and maybe slowing them down a little just on that occasion. So As we mature in the change process, we're looking to improve velocity, volume, stability, and compliance. So today's focus is dynamic risk. I'll explain what we mean by that in a minute. The actual layout of the webinar is a little different from the last ones. This topic is, I think, a little less conceptual and a little more practical than we've been talking about in the last two webinars. So what we want to do is we want to dive in and show you the platform more. There's more demos in this webinar and less slides. So that's one thing to bear in mind. We're going to see if we can get through quite a lot of demo material. And we've got Andrew and Lee on the call with us, who are the SMEs from the engineering team, who are the best placed people to do those demos. I'm going to do a couple of them maybe as well, unfortunately for you guys. So the overall journey for change management, the overall adoption journey, we've covered this before, but we see these as a logical set of steps, and they're not necessarily something your whole organization needs to do at the same time. You can have different teams, different areas, different bits of your business or organization moving at different speeds, but we kind of feel like there's a logical path through these things. It may be that for your organization, some of them happen that you're working on some of the balloons on this line a little bit earlier or later. It's not something that you need to follow prescriptively, but it just feels, when we've talked about it, when we've talked to customers, when we've talked as an engineering team, when we've talked to our implementation teams and partners, this feels like a good logical path through adoption. So we talked in the first webinar about change models. We talked in the second Launch and Learn about approval policies, and now we're talking about dynamic risk. So if we drive into that a little bit more, what does that maturity journey look like for risk? So within each one of those balloons, we have, our own, it has its own maturity curve. And so we're looking at taking you from probably where you are now, where you have a risk score on a change, and that might just be high, medium, low. That might be manually set for the change. You might go in and you might set a change manager or some kind of change assessor would go in and say the change is high, the change is medium, the change is low, and maybe even write a description of word notes. Or you may be using risk assessments, a questionnaire-based approach. But what we're going to show you is the maturity curve through going from there to start using embedded data like success scores, to start using things like risk conditions, which are more structured. Success scores then allow you to start looking at the overall picture around the change. And then predictive intelligence allows you to take into account or to use machine learning, to use AI techniques to assess the change risk from a number of factors, which maybe, just there's too much data for humans to assess. And we've actually found this to be a really good use case for machine learning. We've had some good results, but more about that later. Okay, so I'm going to dive in now with the first section, which is change success scores. So when we talk about change success scores, in a way, they're not really a risk component, right? So change success scores are there to calculate and indicate how well a team are doing, or how well you're doing with a particular model of change or a particular standard change template. We're going to have a quick demo after this, just a couple of minutes that I'll do. But what we want to show you is by using success scores, and this is a pro feature, by the way. I actually said pro feature, just to call that out right at the start. I think most of our customers are now on pro or above, but it's a pro feature. And what this does is there's a job that runs, and it collects data, and it applies multiplier to certain scores within that data, to certain numbers within that data, and that produces a score for a team or for a model. So what that means is if you look at, say, an assignment group, they will have a success score against them for change. And so what we're doing is we're looking at the past history, the last 30 days of changes, and we're seeing how well they've performed over those last 30 days. And we're applying some weightings to the factors in that performance, and we're producing a score from it. And this allows us to do a couple of things, one of which is directly related to risk, the other is kind of indirectly. It allows us to assess team performance. That's not really what we're here to do today. It allows us to see how well the change process is being applied by teams, to see how well they're doing with changes. What we want to do today with it is we want to use it as part of risk. So I'm going to cover it briefly, just as a bit of background to how we use it at risk, and then we're going to show you how we use it within the risk calculations for change management. Okay, look. So what we're going to cover in the demo is just what are success scores and how do you configure them and how do you use success scores. It's to be very brief. Just going to share my screen. Okay, So diving straight in, we have a dashboard. This dashboard is actually in upcoming releases going to be replaced with something somewhere else in ServiceNow. There'll be documentation on that to follow. We're not quite ready to show you that yet, but for the moment, this is where the dashboard lives. This is our change success score dashboard. And you can see in here, we've got scores back from overall change success scores and successful changes. But down here, we've also got the change success score for different assignment groups within the business. So we can see we're scoring this and we've got a raw number. We can also see trend over time. So we can see how they're performing over time. It's kind of difficult to mock this within a demo environment. It relies on a lot of data. You will all have a lot of data within your production environment. So we're not using a real production environment for this, which is why you can't see scores going all the way down. But we have enough data. Also, when you look at the changes for this that we're using within this data set, they were generated, right? We have to do that to create the volume of changes to be able to show you things like how machine learning works or how success scores work. So don't rely on the fact that the wording within the changes makes any sense. We've had to generate these. So if I go into now and have a quick look at change model success. So that was the team success. We also, if you're using change models, again, if we covered them previously, one of the things that change models allows you to do is to start breaking down success a little bit more. So it allows you to see how the purpose of how successful the change with that purpose is doing. So how good you are at change registration, but you may start making models like, for instance, SAP changes, or you start making DevOps changes. As you start using those change models, you can see how successful that change is. And again, that allows you to intervene with those teams. So I said this was going to be a brief demo, and it will be. So how's it configured? So you can see in here we have some thresholds, and this gives us a rating for those scores. So you can see in here we've got a score start and score end, and they match each other, they carry on from each other. And from there, we can give a rating at the moment out the box. We have 4 ratings: low, medium, high, and excellent. And that gives us a view of how good that particular team's success score is. One more thing I'm going to show you is the configuration of the metrics. I can't see it within here. I'm just going to skip over that, and we'll probably just cover it a bit later if someone can come on that later. So that was when we were at the slide before. I was showing you. I'll just share that now. So when we were looking at this slide before, that's where you can configure the multiplier for your success scores. And as we were saying before, this job within Platform Analytics runs on a daily basis to calculate the scores. And it will look at close changes, and it will calculate the success score based on those close changes for the last 30 days. And that's not configurable at the moment. Those time gaps, the daily job and the 30-day period, is not configurable at the moment. But that allows us a good bite of time, a good slice of time that's recent to calculate the success scores for. So what it'll do is it'll look at close changes. It'll look at to see whether there's any P1 incidents attached to those changes. It will look to see whether there were any outages caused by the changes. It will look to see whether they were successful or unsuccessful. It will look to see how many of each of those things there were within that time period for that team or for that model. And then it'll apply the multiplier to those to give you an overall indication of how successful that team is. The default score for change success is 500. So if a team hasn't done any changes, they will sit at 500. They will decrease from that if they're particularly unsuccessful. They will increase from that if they're particularly successful. So moving on, demo recap, just make sure I've covered everything. So we can use the success scores as an input for change risk, and that happens out the box. And we can also use success scores for approval policies. So we can directly check the success scores from approval policies if we want to. We talked about that on the last Launch and Learn. So from within the approval policies, Launch and Learn. And we'll talk a little bit more about the kind of when to use approval policies, when to use risk, when they interact with each other right at the end of this Launch and Learn. Okay. Moving on. So dynamic risk evaluators. Okay, we have 4 ways to calculate your risk score in ServiceNow. And most of you will have come across the first of these, which is risk assessments. So we'll cover that first, and we'll do a demo of that. The next one is risk conditions. I think quite a few people are using risk conditions. So this is a more structured way to capture data. We have a calculated risk score. which looks at the success scores, and so it's really looking at probability and impact. And then we have risk intelligence, which is our machine learning and predictive intelligence based solution. So for calculated risk or risk intelligence, they require an ITSM Pro license at least. So risk assessments. So it's an established way of working, right? We've been doing it for a very long time. And the assessments in ServiceNow are built for change. So there is a survey and assessments module or product that we have within ServiceNow, and we extend that for change management. We will a special one for change management. And what you do to set that up is you go in and you set up some surveys, you bring some questions into the assessment, and then you score those questions according to how important they are. So some of them will have a higher weighting than others. And then what we do is we combine all the answers from that questionnaire and we provide an overall risk score. You can do multiple risk assessments for a change. You might just want to do one, but you can do multiple, and people can refill in the same risk assessment, or possibly even trigger multiple risk assessments of different types for a change. So we record all that against change. So again, although the answers are fairly subjective in those questionnaires, and there's a possibility that they could be gamed. I think people have seen that. So people can fill in multiple questionnaires until they get the right answers. It's all recorded, right? We have an audit trail of who filled it in, when they filled it in, and what score they got on the last one. So it's not something that, although it's subjective, it's something that is auditable and recorded. So it's a good technique in that sense. It can be a little slow. So there's no real automation opportunities here apart from the automation of creating the risk assessment. You rely on a human to then make time to fill it out. We can use it where we have little or no structured data, or we have poor structured data around the change. So if you have a low maturity CMDB, or maybe that area of the business have a particularly low maturity area of the CMDB, maybe it's a vendor or something like that, you don't have visibility of their CMDB, a risk assessment is an appropriate way of working. But where we have structured data, a lot of the questions we ask in the assessment are questions that we could answer with structured data. Like, for instance, are you making a change to a critical service? Well, if you had a good idea of what services are impacted by a change, you could check to see whether there's a critical service, and we'll touch on how you do that later. And it can be a real blocker for velocity of change. So really, in some areas of the business, it's a non-starter. You don't want to be starting to send out surveys to send out risk assessments to DevOps teams, because first of all, they probably won't fill them in, and second of all, the amount of time it takes to do that process is going to considerably slow down a high velocity change process. So we want to introduce more automation there. So it's not really relevant to our shift left processes like DevOps. Okay, we're going to jump to a demo in a second. I'll just introduce what we're covering. Andrew, are we good to do the demo?
Always good to do the demo. Do you just want me to focus on change risk assessment at this stage, and you're going to go through?
Here are the 3 questions we need to answer. So what are change risk assessments? How do I configure them? And how do I use them in the change process? We good on that?
Focus on answering those 3 questions.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
In the demo.
So we'll just do a short demo, just a couple of minutes. It's quite a quick one, this. We'll go into more depth around things which are probably newer to you, like predictive intelligence, like risk conditions, like derived risk score. Sorry, struggling a bit because my brain's full. Right. Andrew, over to you.
Of course, I'm muted. Hopefully you can hear me and see my screen. I'm going to shuffle Zoom around because Zoom is always in the wrong place. Cool. I'm going to do it with SOW, show you a risk assessment actually happening. I'm sure I'm seeing that most of you are already doing this, but I'll do it anyway. And I have a cold too, so I'm going to be coughing. I should have had a glass of water before this. I'm going to create a normal change. I'm logged in as an ITIL user, hopped into the instance. And we'll see risk evaluation here at the bottom, and I'm going to hit assess risk. And here we can see the questions. Does the change affect, have a critical CI? I'm going to answer all of these questions in a way that I know will give me a moderate risk. So I'm just going to do that and submit that. And that means the risk evaluation call to action has finished. Here on this right-hand side, we now see that the risk is moderate. I can click here to view the risk assessment, which shows you the completed risk assessment that you've just done, the last completed risk assessment in a read-only format. And it evaluated to moderate, and for that reason, it is moderate. I'm going to stop from that aspect because I'm sure all of you have seen it running and working. And I'm actually going to stop impersonation, and I'm going to go back into the instance to show you how you create where you find risk assessments, change risk assessments, and how to configure them. And we start by typing risk assessment. And under the change for administration risk assessments, we'll go into what we have. And out of the box, the answer is how many will you have out of the box is it depends how long ago you actually started this, because originally we had a legacy risk assessment, which I will not be demoing, but I'll just touch on that and say we used to ship two. We used to ship software change risk assessment and hardware change risk assessment, but these were amalgamated into a single risk assessment, and I'm going to sort of kind of click into that to kind of show you what we ship out of the box. And I'll mention how we actually built it, because we didn't build it from scratch. We want to reuse as much as we can in ServiceNow so that there's a familiarity across products. And in this case, we're building on surveys and assessments version 2 architecture, the legacy built on the version 1 architecture. And what I'm showing here is that when you, let's say, would create a new risk assessment, I'm just opening an existing one, you would say, well, I need it to match certain types or change models, and that's where it kind of activates from. Arguably, and I think Dan has probably touched on this at some stage, but standard changes, we would argue that you probably wouldn't want to change risk assessment on a standard change. The idea being standard, that it really is kind of low risk out of the box. But that's not to say it is, but we'll kind of focus on this aspect of a risk assessment. We say that it is really geared towards changes of type normal or emergency, or of models, change models of model type normal or emergency, and that it only matches in certain states, like the new, assess, or authorize. Now, a lot of people will get a little bit frustrated when I'll understand why. When you actually create a definition or a condition, you have this thing called a assessment category. Now, as I say, it's built on surveys and assessments technology. We recommend that you only use one category, and in that category, you will have a filter, and you want to repeat. This is a filter, whereas the previous one was a condition, and we simply say make the two identical. As I say, we build on something. We really want to have one category, one definition, and the category has all the questions. And so here, for example, the questions. And we also have like weightings and things like that. And why do we have the weightings? Why do we? Our formula is sum of actual value multiplied by weight of an answer. And I'll go into one of these weightings, if I can remember where it is. And here we have the values, which are, for example, 4, 2, and 1. But the question will have a weighting. I think here is the weight. So let's give this a weight of 10. And the idea behind the weightings is that some customers choose, again, it is subjective, and some questions will, is there a backout policy? Yes or no? It may only have a value of 1 or 2, but the weighting will be 10, so it'll actually give a value of 20, because guess what? That's actually more serious with regards to trying to evaluate that risk. And it's a kind of an attempt to reduce the amount of gamification, because you can put in your answer and try to get the answer that you want. I want this to come out as a low risk change. I'm going to give the answers. I would say that we don't tend to focus on that veracity aspect too much, but I would say that each change that we create, and I'll point that out, and I kind of ramble on that, but for every single assessment that's been completed, to get the result, you must complete it, and we will have a list of completed assessment instances against a change request. it becomes obvious if against one change request you have 20 kind of filled out answers that someone's likely to be gamifying that. But at the same time, once you've somebody has gamified it, I guess they already know what the results will be for the next change request. We never really focus too much on that veracity aspect, but that's where we have the weightings, I suppose, but partially to discourage gamification, partially to identify gamification. But when I said we have this sum of actual values multiplied by weight, that comes to a number, whatever that number may be. And there we've got the thresholds, and we call it thresholds because they have to be surpassed. And I'm just going to order it by that, such that you really always want to have one that's 0, because we don't allow negative values, nor does service and assessments allow negative values. If you ever have a negative value, we used to have them in the past, it's a defect. No negative values. So you kind of, for example, values that are of a minus value. It was possible in the past to kind of mess around with that. We try to avoid that now. So if you, let's say, have an answer, you filled out your answers, and it surpasses a value of 0 to 6, it's a low risk. It's just you get an output number, we surpass a value. When it's 7, it will be moderate. When it's above 11, it's a high risk. That's basically it. So when you're configuring it, you're creating a change risk assessment. You're creating your condition and your filter. Sadly, you have to do both. It's a bit annoying. I get it. And you match a record, a change request record, in certain states, and from that point onwards, it is enabled such that you need to, let's say, fill in a risk assessment. You should. I mean, we don't enforce it, but it can therefore afterwards be enforced. And then, of course, you also have the assessment instances which have been created against this definition. And you can go to the change request itself, and you'll see the assessment instances of this type of change definition against the actual change request. And the one final thing I'm going to touch on, having completed one, I'm going to put in this change risk details. And often there's a question to say, well, how do I know if someone's completed a risk assessment? Should I go and use the risk assessments API? How do I know a risk assessment, or what I would call a risk evaluation, has been completed? We look at the change risk details record, if there is a change risk details record. And if there is one, you've actually done a change. You've done a risk evaluation. That's all of the evaluators, of which risk assessment is one of them. I've forgotten the 3 questions, Dan, but does that show?
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, so I'm going to pop back to my screen. Thank you, Andrew. And just recap on the demo quickly. So an extension of service assessments, they're configured and will be triggered using conditions, and they're weighted so that you can apply different weightings to different questions in the assessment. You can run it many times for a single change, and people often do, but the latest risk assessment is the one that's used for scoring, and the history of risk assessment answers and the risk assessments themselves are stored against the change, so you can see for compliance. Okay, moving on to risk conditions. So risk conditions are a way of capturing more structured data on the change. They are more automated. So you define property and condition-based risk determination. So you say things like, are there any critical services affected in this change? Are there any, is this change during a blackout window? You can look at these things and you can evaluate and set the risk accordingly on the change. The first condition to evaluate is true sets of risk. So you'd be wanting to use your highest rating risk conditions in the list. We'll cover that in a second, as the first ones that fire. There's also, from point of view of it's pretty low code or no code. Sometimes if you're gathering a lot of data on the change, if you want to go and inspect a list of things like the list of affected services, iterate through them and pull back if there's any critical services, there are ways of doing it. We'll talk about that at the end, but that's a code-based approach. But it's very low code-based approach. Sometimes they're just the conditions themselves can just be set using a condition builder. It takes advantage of things like the CMDB. If you've made an investment in the CMDB, risk conditions are a great way to go because they leverage that investment And also they drive change velocity. Because they're automated, they just happen. No one needs to fill them in. You don't need to wait for anyone to fill them in. They should fire in a few seconds, and then you'll have a risk evaluation done on the change. They do require good referential data. So they do require you to have either a good CFDB or good data on the change itself, depending on what you're looking at. They take a little bit of thinking in terms of your process to implement. So you may have to do a tiny bit of rethinking about if you've got compliance documents around risk assessments and you need to cover how risk conditions fire, that may be something you need to cover. And they require a little bit of engineering effort. They require a little bit of going in as a ServiceNow admin and maybe scripting a condition. There are lots of examples out there in community. We provide some out of the box for you. Hopefully we're looking to provide more. But they are a great way of speeding up the change process. They're a great way of using structured data. They're a great way of taking subjectivity out of the change process where you can. Also, they can be used for particular models. So if you have areas where, a particular model like DevOps has a degree of good structured data by nature, you can use them there, and you can choose to use assessments where maybe that data doesn't exist. So you can mix and match these approaches. And the actual risk evaluator, which we'll cover in a few more slides, is a way of bringing all these things together in one place. So we're going to go to another demo now. Andrew, over to you, but we just want to see what risk conditions are, how do you configure and build them, and how do you use them in the change process. So Andrew, over to you again.
Cool. Thank you very much. I'm going to start sharing my screen.
Yeah.
Yikes. And I just grabbed the Zoom thing. The Zoom is always in the wrong place every single time. Cool. Once again, hopefully you can see my screen. This time we're going to focus on risk conditions, in which case I will just start by saying to find them, you'll type risk conditions. I hate the term risk conditions. I've always been an advocate, 11 years or 12 years working on these. I believe that they're known risk issues, of which the last one is there are no expected risk issues found. And I'm going to touch on Daniel's favorite one, which is the insufficient lead time, because that is actually the simplest one to look at. It's a kind of a joke. It's probably not a good and accurate one, but nevertheless, it gives a great demo. Whether it's a good predictor of risk is questionable. But to start with, it simply is to say, if you're actually going to create a change request and you're scheduling it to start this afternoon, my goodness, it sounds pretty rushed. Surely that's a high risk. Surely you need at least 3 days for people to kind of look at it, analyze it, approve it, etc. So if you're scheduling a change request within less than 3 days, it's high risk. So here's an example. We say insufficient lead time. That we say I believe it to be high. I want it also has an impact field. I'll unfortunately have to touch on that a little bit. Sorry, Dan. I also need to talk about the order, the advanced conditions, the script conditions, and the condition builder. But as Dan said, it can be very, very low code. It can say, well, okay, I want to set the risk to high. I don't want to affect the impact. Fair enough. I want the order to be 100. It's first to match. The first risk condition that matches is the one that will be applied. And if no risk conditions match, I will focus on the no expected risk conditions found, because otherwise nothing will bring risk down. Because sometimes you may say, well, I want the highest of all the risk evaluators, but unless you have something that actually brings it down, it will never go down. The only way to bring it down is to have what I guess a default, but using the risk conditions to bring it down. But again, quickly kind of touching on this one. So we're saying, okay, it's got a description, great. And we're saying, well, the planned start date is not empty, and the planned start date is a relative date on or before 3 days from now. Nice and kind of simple. And we only want it to apply in new, assess, or authorize. Well, why is that? Well, okay, so what happens afterwards? Let's say, imagine that it's an implement. Let's say you continue to do this at implement. When you do an update, this will likely as not match, and it will be when you're implementing saying, yeah, I've implemented this successfully. It was a low risk. I did it 3 days before relative, and I'll implement it to successful. By the way, this is updated and it matches insufficient lead time, high risk. What? So you want to be careful with this one as well, because you want it to only match in certain states. That's probably why it's not an ideal kind of out of the box one, but it kind of gives a good example of what a low level risk condition could be. I'll have a look at another couple which are more complex. Let me see if one. All right, let's start with one which is a little bit less, a little bit more complex, which is use advanced conditions. So instead of having a condition builder, you want to, instead of looking at the change request record itself, you want to query, let's say, the CMDB CI service table. Please beware, don't just query the CMDB CI service table. It's big. So we say where this has got an association to it, for example, and if the CMDB CI service that's being changed on this happens to be critical, then the answer is true. So here we have here we have some code that's written. So there's a kind of a slight barrier to entry. You do need to write code in order to actually get the value, but all you're responding here is true or false. And if the answer is true, it will set the risk to high. So that gives you that, instead of a condition builder, an advanced scripted condition. But what is it the risk set to? Well, it's still a drop-down list, so you don't need to actually do any code. By the way, I'm going to point out again, impact. Risk conditions should have been called risk and impact conditions, because impact is used, and impact is almost an input to risk's output. But I'm just going to mention that unfortunately it was built a long time ago. It does two slight things like that. And then I'm going to focus on the most sort of advanced one, where it's code everywhere. And that's where you've got the advanced condition and the script field, although you could just have still a condition builder and then have the output being set to something, but you can have it fully scriptable, where you're saying, well, I want some script some script to actually run to see if it matches, and then it should just answer true or false. And if it does match, then I want to set the current, which is at this stage and always is, change request or an extension thereof change request, and you're setting it manually. Impact 1, risk 2, whatever. You can set it to anything. Please never, ever, ever, ever put current.update in here. I know it happens. This isn't effectively a before business rule. You split the transaction, and it's something that we really, really never do. It will break everything in the risk evaluation. So I'll just repeat it. Never put current.update or update in either of these advanced conditions or the script values. You can, don't do it, please, please, please. Those are the three risk conditions that we put out of the box, but I will show this one last one, which kind of brings it's almost like nothing brings the risk down. Once it's been set to, let's say, moderate, it'll stay moderate. The only way we can bring it down is with this default one. So if nothing else matches, we will set the risk to low and the impact to low. And that's kind of your default one. And that's why it's 400. I always talk, I'm going to stop talking unless, Dan, you want something else for me to show here?
No, we're good. That's good. Thank you, Andrew. Again.
Do you want to quickly see it in action? I'll talk to you and just show you it happening. Yeah, sorry, I do apologize. I forgot
while you find that, just a note on the lead time. It's been shown a lot these days that lead time is not a good indicator of change success, and that's why we are not advocating using that as a risk condition. There are places where it would certainly make sense. We know that, but for things like DevOps changes, actually low lead time normally leads to a greater chance of success. So
it's very easy to demo, which is why I use it. Here we've got the risk as moderate. So I'm just going to, sorry, I do apologize. I'm going to do a standard change. I don't want to do a risk assessment. I just want risk conditions to run. So I was being silly. Pre-approved. I'll take one of these. Save that. Cool. The risk is moderate. I'm going to calculate risk, and that will do and execute the risk conditions. And it says risk has been set to low. Impact remains unchanged because it was already low. And why? Because the risk condition rule, no expected risks found. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, okay, I'm going to schedule it for today, starting right now, finishing tomorrow, saving that. Actually, I could have calculate risk because it will save it for you. Calculate risk, and now it will be a high risk. Why is it a high risk? Because there's insufficient lead time. Yes, it's not a good predictor of risk. I know, but it demos very easily. So I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm just going to go back and share my screen. We'll just do a quick recap on the demo. Everyone see my screen? So risk conditions automate the process of assessing risk. They can be triggered according to the data that's in your change. So you can trigger certain risk conditions based on certain features of the change, certain attributes of the change. They allow you to ensure that your organizational compliance is met if you have an organizational policy that says that any change that is to a critical service needs to have certain types of approval. You can drive that through making the change high risk and sending it to CAO. As an example, they provide an audit trail, so you can see what condition was met and why it fired, and so therefore why the change was risked in a certain way. And again, take the subjectivity out of risk decisions and allow the use of structured data. So making good on the investment we've made around ServiceNow and the CMDB and other surrounding data, the relationships, etc., and also allowing that change to flow faster because of it. Okay. So calculated risk score. So we're getting a little bit more complex as we go along. We're probably getting into areas now where people are a little bit more unfamiliar. I think almost everyone was familiar with risk assessments. Less people were familiar with the risk conditions. The calculated risk score is a combination of success probability and impact. And the success probability is calculated from our success scores, which we saw earlier. And the impact is determined from things like risk conditions. So it can be tailored to individual models as well. There is the ability, and we won't show this today, I don't think, because we probably don't have time, but there is the ability to tailor this to particular models. And if you get into that kind of space, then there are articles and blogs out there and our doc site that show you how to do that. Probability and impact matrix, so combining those two scores together to give you a risk is an established best practice within the industry. Whether you use it or not, it's up to you, but it isn't something that's kind of weird and wacky and out there. It's something that's been done for years. And it's a no-code configuration as well on the whole. The cons are the derived risk rating can be slightly confusing, right? Because it's derived, so you're not seeing A, therefore B, you're seeing a little bit in between. So you need to understand that. You need to build that kind of understanding into the change team and into people who maybe need to understand a bit more about risk of change in detail. The components, again, there's more components, so it makes it a bit more complex to understand. We talked before about this, but it requires good practice in change review and closure because you're using success scores. And also, if sometimes it can be a bit misleading if teams are low volume change users and they have that score set to 500 in their change success score just because they haven't done any changes. But those are all things we can take into account. And as we will show later in the demos, this isn't the only way of assessing change. So we're looking at different aspects of the change risk, and we're going to use the most risky of those to assess the change overall. So in the demo, we're going to see what the calculated risk score is and how to configure it and how it's used in the change process. Will I hand over to you now, Andrew?
Yes, sorry, I was trying to ask questions. Absolutely, I will calculate risk. Yep.
Cool.
Okay, cool. So calculated risk score is also the as we said, it's I'll show it. That's the easiest one. I'll start by showing it. And we'll see it in two places. And I'll show it here on Classic, and I'll show you here that you've got this aspect of calculated impact plus change success score, and it gives in this case a value of high, and that doesn't give you a great deal of information. And where in fact we get a little bit more, and we're working on giving it a lot more kind of background and information. So I'm going to go into SOW to show you a little bit more of that. And try to remember which change request it is. It's 206, for example. Okay. And here we actually see a little bit more when we have this risk card. Here we see, for example, the change success score, which is actually a team success score, but okay, the change success score, and it's a numeric value, 769, for example. And we have a model success score, 83%, but I know we're focusing a little bit on the change success score. I'm going to lean on my colleague, Mr. Lee, for this one, on how to configure this. I'll also point out in the in Classic, to get more information about the team success score, the change success score, you go to the actual assignment group, and you'll click on this little side button here, and this is the bit which we kind of talk about and show with regards to what this number has come from. For example, this team has actually got a total of 170 changes. So you actually get a breakdown of, how many they've done, how many they've changed. So because obviously you could have a great success score, but in fact you may have a count of one and one. And so this gives you a breakdown more of that. But again, it's not so much it's similar to in a subjective way. We know that there's veracity, but it actually really affects only one aspect in the calculated risk score, and that is the probability. And I'm going to point this out. So if we remember that we've got this 762, and I need to I don't remember the tables, so I'm going to try to find what my cheat sheet of tables. Okay, they're all like that. I only remembered one. All right, we're going to go a little bit backwards. I'm going to put that in there. And I'm going to say, okay, so first here's that matrix so that you've got, how do we get to, let's say, moderate or high risk? We've got this aspect of impact and probability. So if an impact, and remember, I was touching on the risk conditions. The risk conditions also set impact. And if you want to use the risk and impact or calculated risk score, I know we focus very much on the change success score, but the change success score focuses on the probability, this block here. So whatever your change success score is, this is part of it. And it certainly does affect the risk. And of course, if there is a veracity aspect, it shouldn't be completely relied upon. It can be gamified. At the same time, what you can then do is, well, if that's the case, you would adjust your matrix to say we don't trust the success score, because so then in which case you would just kind of say, well, moderate and high actually lead to a high risk, and that you give more gravitas or more, you lean more on the impact. And how do you do the impact? The impact is subjective. It is based on the change risk conditions. For example, is this a critical service? Are there more than 10,000 people using this, or 100,000 people using this, etc., etc.? What is the actual impact? So you've got this matrix of working out this risk, and as I say, the probability is only on this part of that matrix. But let's go back one step, and I'm going backwards, I know, but because we've got this number, how do we get from this number to, let's say, high, moderate, low? So I think it's in my, let's see, calculated lookup in my history. Cool. So here we've got the change model success score, the change success score, and the calculated success probability. And here I'm going to group these by definitions. And we're going to, and the one, again, we do out of the box go with DevOps and cloud infrastructure, but the one that matches everything, that definition that matches everything, generally is the site reliability engineering. And here we've got, again, another matrix, and it's always this kind of matrix of matrices that, so here we're taking the change model success score, comparing it against that team success score or change success score. And again, we're setting the probability. So remember that even though we're doing impact versus probability, first we work out the probability, which is a matrix of model success score, which I kind of touched on and show. No, I'll show it again. I'll show the model success score here. So for example, these are some of the I clicked on it, that'll teach me. You can see the success rate of most of these standard changes are 100%, but here you've got change VLAN. The success rate of this particular standard change is 67%. And if I go to models, emergency change is 82% and 83%. So you've got that coming as your input here, and your input against there. But that's still, you're going to ask, well, hold on, where's this? So, this number 762, where's that coming from? Because I want to know where this particular one, column comes from. And off the top of my head, I'm going to type success score, and Mr. Lee is going to save me to remind me where I go to get that. But I'm going to type success. I had a cheat sheet, and I'm thinking it's this one, but it could be the one above. Let me click into this. I think this is just the same one. I'm looking for the actual scores to the, and here, finally, yada, yada. Okay, so, and this table is the SN change probability success. I really should learn these tables. Absolutely not. I don't want to learn these tables. So here we've got the kind of scores for the change model scores as percentages 0, 60, and 80 because they're percentages. And here we've got 0, 430, 850. So if I get a score of 700 and whatever it was, 69, where we have a moderate degree of success, and where it's, let's say, over 850, like 900, then you have a very high probability of success, and vice versa. So when you actually get your score, all it does is give you a calculated success probability of low, moderate, high, which is then compared to the change model success low or high, which is then compared to the probability as which is compared to impact success low or high, which finally gives you the risk. So while yes, it is success score is based on the veracity of your teams, it's really a very small piece of that puzzle. I'm going to stop and say, is that good enough?
That's what we need to see. So as you can see, that there are a set of tables in there, and this is documented, right? And the reason there's a set of tables is we want to derive a score. So we want to be able to, first of all, work out what's more important, the out of the model success or the team success, and produce a rating based on that. And then we want to be able to configure that so that we use it to compare to the impact of the change, compare the two together, and then that will give us a risk score. So there's a couple of jumps away from the change record itself. That's all recorded, and that's all a part of the initial configuration. Once that's configured, it just runs the changes so that we can then get a derived score for use there. I'm going to just share my screen and go back onto the slide. So takes into account the past performance of the team and the model being used for the change. And the probability of success is then combined with the risk of the change, and a score is produced. Like I said before, it's a little bit to get your head around, all those different tables to jump across, but it is something that once you kind of look into it, there are just a couple of tables, there's a couple of matrices involved to configure. Once they're done and you're up and running, you can use them. Okay, so now we're going to talk about dynamic risk evaluation using risk intelligence. So if you are an ITSM Pro customer, you have the ability to use this. It's a transformational way of working. So it's doing things differently to how you do them now, probably, right? We have customers who are using this in anger in their instances. We have large customers who are using it. It works with large volumes of data. There are two ways of configuring this. You can do it via classification or via similarity. You don't need to worry about that too much. They are explained on our doc site. But for you to use the classification, which is the more accurate of the two engines, you need more than 10,000 changes in the system, which it can look at, or within the set that it's looking at to create data. The good thing is, though, you can use this in information-only mode. So if you have it, you can switch it on, and then that allows you to then run it to see what it would have said the risk of the change was using machine learning. Now, we have found with testing, and we have found with customers, that it's very accurate. It's a really good use case for ML, and we're quite proud of it, right? We're quite proud of how well it works. We'd like more people to use it. And also, when we look at the next topic, which is around how we combine all these things together, it certainly isn't it isn't the only thing we'll ever look at. We always take kind of paranoid approach to risk. So if any of the methods you use to create a risk score for your change come back with it being a high risk change, we would use that. If any of them come back with it being medium and it was risked as low, the other one's risked as low, we would use the medium risk rating. So we're always taking the more paranoid approach to these things. It is actually technically a low point of entry. You don't need to understand machine learning. You don't need to be able to write code to do this. Out of the box, the solution works really well. You can tweak and train it, and that again is quite kind of easy to understand. You need to get your head around a little bit around what's effective data to train this on, and until you get to that point, we suggest using it out of the box. But I'll show you that in a second. It takes into account the wider change landscape. So when we look at the risk of a change, we're not saying we're just looking at this change and what's happening right now to risk that change. We're looking at past change history to give us an idea about what the risk of this change is. And that's effective with a large number of changes. Some cons about this. I mean, it may take a bit of organizational shift to get your organization's compliance people around the idea that you're no longer having a human in the loop for one of your risk processes. The others are still there, but for one of the risk processes, you're not doing that. and that may be something that requires a bit of conversation, and it requires a relatively high volume of change to be effective and to be used. And again, it's only as good as the data you provide it with. So it's not a magic wand that will fix your data for you, but if you have reasonably good data, it will provide good insight for you. Okay, I'm doing the demo on this one. So we're going to show what the predictive intelligence solution is, and we're going to show how to configure it. And we're going to have a little look at how you might train and improve that model, and how to use predictive intelligence in the change process, which is very straightforward. Share my screen. Okay. Do this, I've been logged out. The instance. Jeez. Talk amongst yourselves while we just get into the instance. We're very near the Q&A, by the way. We're not going to run over, we're on time, so we'll have plenty of time for Q&A after this. Okay. So if I go in here and I type predictive intelligence, you can see in here there's a whole section on predictive intelligence. And if I go to here for predictive intelligence homepage, we can see that there are some solutions loaded. This is a plugin you need to enable. How to do it is on our doc site. Once the plugin's enabled, you will see that there is a change risk classification and change risk similarity machine learning solution. We would suggest if you have enough records to do classification, then that's the approach you should take. Again, we don't need to go into the detail of why that happens, but classification only works with over 10,000 records. So if you have over 10,000 change records, then go into this one. Once we're in the classification record, we will then define what the machine learning training will take into account when it runs. So what we're doing is we're configuring, first of all, to create a data set for us. So we don't want to look at standard changes within the set because they will probably give us a false readout. So we're excluding standard changes. This is how it's configured out of the box, by the way. And we want to only look at changes that are closed because we want to look at past history of closed changes. That makes sense as well. And the output field we're going to is risk. Again, that should be obvious, right? We're looking to set the risk with this thing. The fields we're looking at are short description and implementation plan. So the only fields on the change that it's going to consider when it's building its magic risk knowledge is the short description implementation plan. You may want to look at other fields, but for the start, just keep it simple, because actually, though it may be compelling to put more fields in there to look at more data, machine learning solutions work better when they have large data sets and when they can draw analysis across having a lot of similarity between things. The more things you put in there, the more it will kind of spread out the data for the algorithms that work to configure machine learning. So run it first as it is out of the box, see what you get, see how it works. You don't have to use it in anger in the change, you can just run it and see how it works. Okay, so we then train the solution, and this solution has been trained. So once the solution is trained, it will then rerun periodically to update the data in the
model.
In the model. Thank you. Lee, Andrew, please feel free to step in if I start garbling my words on this one. Okay, so you can see in here we got 1,800 records matching the condition. You probably want a few more than that. In a live instance, you'd have a few more than that. Okay, so when this is run, it will then produce an output into risk for you. So when we look at if we could change, so definitions workspace, going to change not in sense of one of the, if I go to this change, see if it's a risk assessment run it. So I'm struggling here to get the window up that shows me. Nope, it's not asking me to run the risk calculation. Why is that? Okay, so we can look at that in a minute, but when we look at the risk, one of the aspects of the risk will be set by machine learning. It will just come back with a value for us, high, medium, or low. It won't really tell us how it's done that, right? Because it's machine learning. It just imagine it does it kind of by magic. It's not magic, but kind of imagine that. What we find is that the best way of assuring yourself that it's working is by looking at how it's applied to changes, is by using it, not using it in anger, but using it just as a kind of pilot alongside, and that can be set. So you're not actually going to use it for risk assessments. The next stage after that, and you can look at that and see how well it compares to, after changes close, how good a job it made of determining the risk. Again, we found it to be very accurate. The next stage you can go to is start using that as part of a whole set of risk conditions, which are part of our risk evaluator. And that's what I'm going to show now.
Dan, before you do show, I've given you a link to show which one of the changes is actually has the risk ML running.
Thank you very much. That's brilliant. Thanks. So presumably you can see this one. Okay. So in here, yeah, we can see that risk intelligence has rated this change as high risk, and it actually matched the calculated risk score and the risk condition rules. You'll find when you look at your data, this will probably match a lot. Right? That's what we found from customers talking to us and what we found from our own testing. And so the risk of the change has been set to high. So we will go into how the risk evaluator works, and you'll see how this will be used. When risk intelligence fires, it will only take that into account if risk intelligence thinks that the risk is higher than your other methods, sort of. So it's a good way of increasing your ability to detect risk within the system. It will never lower the risk with risk intelligence. Okay, so I'll go back to my slides. Just do a recap. Okay. So it's an out-of-the-box solution provided with ITSM Pro. You need a Pro license to use it. It works in most cases with very little configuration. You can just switch it on and start running, train it, start running. It has to be configured a little bit to work with your data and processes. If you have a highly configured change process, if you're not using the short description field, for instance, and you decided to call it something else and put it somewhere else, it won't pull much data from a blank field that you're not using. So it may be something that you need to configure to work with your own implementation. You can trial it without live use, and it's both accurate and useful. Okay, so the risk evaluation process, and Andrew, you can jump in with this one as well, because this is kind of Andrew's slide. So when we do the risk evaluation framework, we look at the set of things we've just shown you, and we move through them, and we will only ever take, or we will use the highest risk from those things which are in the risk evaluation framework. So we look at the risk conditions, the risk assessment, the risk intelligence, and the risk and impact probability, and we will take the highest one of them. We will display to you what all those different aspects of change risk are on the change, and we store them so you can see them for the change. And we will highlight the highest one of them, and that will be our derived risk value. So quite simple in a way that you can use one or more of these types of assessing risk. You can use all four of them if you want. When the change is then, when the risk evaluation is done, it will set to the highest of those values, and it will come up with a derived risk score. Okay, so we've seen that already. The demo I was going to show you was just really around showing the box and showing you that that several methods of evaluation have taken place, and we've picked this one because it was the highest one. That's what we use for the change, and that's why the risk of the change has been set to high. Of course, change managers, people, depending on your implementation, can always override the risk on a change, but it's telling you why that risk was calculated by the system, by our risk evaluation process. Is there anything I should add about the risk evaluation process, Andrew?
Well, a couple of things that I suppose only the risk of intelligence one can be, so to speak, run but turned off, because if the other ones match, it will take the highest risk of whatever matches, except for risk intelligence, which can be turned off for the reasons you've already described.
Yeah, so just to recap on that again, so you could have risk intelligence running in the background and it will not be used by the risk evaluation framework until you tell it to be used in anger. So that allows you to experiment and gain some confidence that it's producing good scores for you. Andrew?
Am I going to quickly share again for this one?
I think we're good. I think we've shown how it works. So we'll leave some
I was just going to point out, I suppose, then you've got the change risk details table, which shows the previous risk evaluation and the latest risk evaluation. It gives all the values that you actually had, and you can use that There's often the case where people say, "Oh, I don't want to move forward until risk conditions have run, until let's say risk assessment has run, until risk is evaluated." Drive that on your change risk details table, because each one has run or has not run individually, or holistically, which is what the risk was. So that's where you would, for the process aspect, based on whether you want to move forward or not allow move forward, or know what has run, what hasn't run, etc. Please use the change risk details as your single source of truth. That's what we mean by the framework. All of these will feed into that table.
So that's if you want to create, say, business rules, or if you're in the future going to be using state transition conditions. In fact, we've just come off a call. We were talking about how we can make this easier for you to do and provide some stuff out of the box for you. But we want you to be able to say, don't move from this state to this state until a risk evaluation is run. Move automatically from this state to this state when a risk evaluation is run. Those kind of things. Again, in the future, in the near future, we're looking to make that a lot easier to do. Okay. So one last thing, which is really just a quick discussion, is on the difference between risk and approval policies. So this is a slide you'll have seen before. So using approval policies to drive approval, because ultimately the risk on a change is kind of useful, right? Saying high, medium, low, but it should drive what you do with the change. And what you do with the change is you drive an approval process. Now, there are two ways you can apply what we've got here. So you can just put the risk into the approval policies and say, if the change is high risk, then route it to CAB. That's valid, right? We're not arguing with that at all. What you can also do is you can directly look at some of the things that we've shown here from the approval policy too. So you can say, well, if it's high risk, send it to CAB. But also, if this affects more than 3 critical services, we also want it to go to CAB, right? Regardless of the risk of the change. So without wanting to confuse everyone too much, but just to kind of highlight how this is implemented, there's a combination of risk being used in approval policies directly, that derived risk score being used directly in approval policies. But there's also the ability to look at some of the aspects you've identified as important to the change in the approval policy directly as well. And that way, not only are they used in the risk assessment, they are also audited as being part of your approval process. So again, it's like belt and braces. You can use it to drive approval policy, which is then auditable and again helps you meet compliance. And what we have at the moment is we have a rich API in change that allows you to make calls. So you can make calls to go and get the success score. You can make calls to go and see whether impacted services are affected by the change. And one of the things we're looking to do in the near future as well is just to make sure that that's very kind of complete and robust, so that you can just make one-line code calls. Your developers can just make one-line code calls, and they can make that from a risk condition saying, does this affect a critical service? Or they can make it from an approval policy and say, does this affect a critical service? And that way, because you're just making that one call, that one-line call, it's making sure that it's making the same call in both places, so you don't have confusing data or conflicting data. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to drive the approval process through risk, which is good and valid and best practice. And we're also trying to allow you to think about the things that are used in your risk process to directly call them from the approval process if necessary, which is a kind of higher maturity thing, because then you've got the ability to say, a lot of compliance documents say this change needs this type of approval, a service manager approval, if it's affecting their critical service. Okay, so that's what we wanted to cover. We're going to go to Q&A now, but I think we just have one last slide, which is just a recap on the framework. So risk conditions, risk assessment, risk intelligence, risk impact and probability, all drive a derived risk score. And we take the highest risk that comes out of them to get to the derived risk score, and that is the risk on the change, which you can then use in places like approval policy. Okay, we are good for Q&A.
Okay, let's see what we got. Aaron, do you want to come off mute and ask your question? I just enable you to talk.
Yeah, sure. This is Aaron Butel. It was mentioned earlier on the call, there was a new feature coming called Incidents Caused by Change ML. Is that coming with Xanadu? Or is there any information related to that feature? It's something key for us to work on in 2025.
We are currently working hard to try and make sure that we understand better the incidents caused by change. The feature we had to do that did not produce very good results. So it did not link incidents with changes very well. And it's something that now we have new opportunities because we have new products and technology with ML. It's certainly something that is a kind of a priority to build and do. We don't have any particular version in target for when that happens, but it's something where as soon as we have something that we know is robust and we know works, we will be making available.
That sounds great.
We'd love to do it. We'd love to do it. And it's all about that thing we talked about before, which is first of all understanding how good you are at closing out change. You know, was it successful? Was it not? Then attaching incidents to a change. But then there's also the kind of picture around a change, which is like, I have a change that was successful because the change was done perfectly, but another team didn't know the change was coming and they didn't update their API, so their system failed, right? That's still a successful change, but it had some impact. And we don't want kind of hand-wringing about whether that change was unsuccessful or not. We just want to be able to show you that there was some impact and maybe incorporate that into our risk management ideas. Okay. Questions?
We have nothing else in the Q&A, so if folks have any questions, please just raise your hand. We can talk about it live. Okay, Jason, may allow you to talk. You're
Hi,
up.
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi there.
Hi there. So the question is quality of data and CMDB. So is it possible in the risk to write rules that reflect the quality of data in the CMDB?
I'd say possible, but extremely hard. I've not really thought about it. What we have thought about doing rather than that is improve change managers' ability to analyze over lots of changes rather than that specific change, but work out where there's areas of business where there is a risk and maybe have some way of informing change managers about why that risk exists. So I think there's more opportunity to be able to go and say, this particular area of the business seems to be having a lot of failed changes. We have a discrepancy between what they think the risk is going to be or impact of a change is when they assess the change to what actually happens afterwards. So a before and after comparison of risk and impact, and be able to work out areas where that isn't lining up, where the people say it's a low risk change and it's high, and then it goes wrong and it's high risk. Oh, sorry, low impact change and it goes wrong and it's high impact, or where they're failing a lot and they say they have low risk changes. We want to be able to provide more insight in that areas, and that's something we're working with both the ML teams and also the Gen AI teams to be able to provide kind of human understandable output, saying with the AI saying we think this area needs to work on the CMDB relationships because they have poor quality. So we're going to do some follow-ups on that when we get some more concrete information on what we're doing there.
Yeah, because obviously the calculations are only as good as the data.
Yeah.
The key is knowing whether the data is good. And if you have teams where you know their data is good, then it's more reliable.
Confidence. So we want to be able to give some idea. The kind of working idea is that we want to be able to give a confidence score. I mean, I'm not saying it will literally be that, but in my head, that's what I'm thinking. We want to be able to say risk and impact and also confidence in what that thing is. So if we have a low confidence that it's going to be low risk, then it makes it higher risk inherently.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Sorry. Anyone else?
This is Aaron again.
Hey.
I was am looking for like good evidence for like a crawl, walk, run approach to implementing these features that come from ServiceNow, and like what the exit criteria might be before moving to enabling risk intelligence. In my current environment, I don't think that our quality of data is high enough. I think talking to a point that was made earlier, to enable risk intelligence. I want to enable it with it kind of toggled on, but not incorporated into the risk score.
Yeah.
as has been detailed here.
Yeah.
But I'm just trying to get a sense for how you would, have a confidence that it's actually going to deliver something of value.
Well, first of all, yeah, with each implementation, you're going to have your own specific issues, and also because ML isn't using kind of human thought processes to produce what it produces, you may be surprised at what it brings out from the data that you have, right? So that's the first thing I'd say. We've seen that before. As you've pointed out, don't use it in anger until you're confident that it's working well for you. But by all means, switch it on, ensure that it's not running as part of the risk process, the risk assessment process. But I don't think, I mean, what we're showing here is kind of how you would use the maturity curve around how you would use these things. So, first of all, you've got risk assessments, risk conditions, which are static, kind of fairly static risk scores that just look at that change. You've then got success scores, which are looking at the wider picture of change. And again, they don't rely on the CMDB, they're just relying on people doing, filling out the change success correctly. Risk predictive intelligence is probably something that most people would consider further on along the line because they've got to do some organizational work to adopt it. But actually, if you've just pointed out, you can adopt it earlier in a kind of non-live sense and see how good the data is, and then watch it, if necessary, watch it improve as you improve your data landscape and use it at a point that you think is appropriate. Just to come back to Jason's point, we have failed change feedback loop and generate insights for risk there on our roadmap, which is what he was talking about just then. Okay, who was just?
I just want to add what Dan already said. Yeah, in terms of data volume, classification solution, ML solution is what we recommend out of box, but that requires minimum 10,000 change request record to be trained on. So if customer has less than 10K records, then similarity solution can be tried instead. Yeah, I think the minimum requirement is 1,000. So from user perspective, one is that use the similarity, and another thing is that try out different field combination instead of the out-of-box short description and implementation plan, and to see what kind of result it generates, and to see if that generates some value for your instance.
We find a lot of cases where people, or I've seen a lot of cases where when the change is being filled in what we consider incompletely, like maybe there's no CI on the change, quite often people are typing that into the short description box or the description box in those cases. So because they don't have that CI or they couldn't be bothered searching for it, whatever it is. So it can be quite surprising how good the ML solution is at assessing risk when you don't think you've necessarily got good surrounding data.
I'll add to it that in certain hackathons, we also wanted to see how we can gamify the machine learning. And of course, we know what algorithm it's using. So we were easily able to gamify and work out how to get a risk to be moderate, high, or low. The aspect is that unlike risk assessment, which you can gamify in a few minutes, with the ML solution, we were feeding it a lot of data to gamify it. And that means you're feeding it a lot of change requests, which are kind of bogus. So it's harder to gamify. I suppose if you're having veracity issues and with regards to things like risk assessments and risk being, being played, then the ML gets around a lot of gamification, unless, of course, you're allowing your users to enter a lot of, shall we say, bogus change requests.
How do you counter the, let's say they plan a change and the plan itself didn't depict what actually was happening, and so it ends up ultimately failing. How do you correct for that in what the machine learning is modeling after? Like if there's a group that is just submitting terrible planned changes and they're not depicted in a way that's meaningful, isn't that like kind of muddying up your model?
I think again, it's around analysis and understanding of failed change as well. So, Jason, have you got a question? No, it's a hand up, or is your hand just still up? So just to finish up on that one, we want to be able to drive two ways with this. We want to be able to understand with better use of ML, improving the ML solutions we have to extend them beyond the kind of raw risk capability here into understanding what the impact of a change was and making the actual change process better. Understanding also patterns around where teams are maybe not filling in things properly or not filling in things truthfully, possibly as well. We have opportunities around that with text processing and Gen AI. There's lots of stuff happening right now, but we're in the early days of that. And but to give you an idea of what we're thinking, failed change analysis, understanding the detail behind why certain areas of the business are maybe able to do failed change properly and some aren't filling it properly, and then understanding for those failed changes which ones had the right impact and which didn't have the right impact, and then further from that, understanding when you risk changes for certain areas and certain teams, how confident we can be in that risk from looking at failed changes is really important too. And because it's large sets of data, it feeds well into generative AI, it feeds well into machine learning.
And I'm just going to extend that a little bit further. So you've got one team that's feeding in, shall we say, bad data. They have to feed in a lot. That's the thing. So if that particular team is doing the majority of changes and pushing them through, then yes, you'll muddy your model. But generally, that's not the case. And if there's one team and let's say it's 10% of the entire, it's not going to muddy it. We found that you really have to put in a lot of data, a lot of bad data to give it the results you kind of want, to skew the results. If you want to skew the results, it's got to be a large amount. And that's what, of course, it can be done. If there is a team that's determined to muddy your model, it's possible, of course. But you'll also be able, I guess you would then look and say, goodness, why is this team doing 100,000 changes a week and the others are doing like 100? It's really got to be quite a large scale of different to kind of to sway the model.
Greg.
Great. I think we're at time. Thanks everyone who's still on.
Yeah.
Please complete the survey after. We read all those responses and we really want to make these better. So it's really helpful if you do that. And that's it. We'll see you in, I think, 2 weeks for our DevOps session.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.